Assalamu alaikum. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salamu ala Rasulil Kareem. Amma ba'd. Dear brothers and sisters, welcome to a special edition of Face to Face. We're going to be focusing on Islamophobia, the rise of Islamophobia. And inshallah, we're going to try to cover it in different ways. We're going to obviously look at the most obvious form of Islamophobia that many of us know about, the attacks that happen on the streets against our sisters, or when property like masajid are attacked. But also we're going to look at the role of media and the impact it has on Islamophobia, and also going to explore also institutionalized Islamophobia. With me, alhamdulillah, I have a great panel. Kerry Bullivant, who's an activist, is going to be joining me in the studio live. I also have Sahar Al-Faifi. She'll be joining us via Skype, and also Mazen Beg from Cage via Skype as well. So without any delay, I'm going to go to my first guest, Kerry. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah for having me on.
Barakallah feekum. Shall I call you Kaleem or Kerry?
Kaleem.
Kaleem, mashallah. Right. So look, I mean, we're talking about Islamophobia, and it is a topic that's been discussed quite a lot.
Yeah.
There is a rise in it. I mean, in the last few weeks, we've seen what's happening in France and in Europe. In terms of media itself, I mean, you're someone who's always on the media, prominent on the media, spokesperson as well. I mean, what role do you think media has in this, and what's the impact of some of the way the media reports on Muslims?
The reality is, sadly, that the media acts as sort of like the petrol on the fire of Islamophobia. It's not necessarily the original source in a lot of cases, but it is the accelerant that spreads it around and makes sure that it reaches everybody.
How does this happen?
Well, for example, you just need to look at the way that the newspaper headlines cover any sort of case involving Muslims. And there have been studies that have shown that the vast majority of times that Muslims are even mentioned in the news, it's only and primarily directly in relation to negative stories and terrorism-related issues. But you see, for example, stories with headlines like "Muslim plot to kill the Queen" and things like this. These sorts of things create a massive negative perception in the wider general population.
But wouldn't the argument be, if Muslims were involved, what's wrong with mentioning Muslims?
Well, what we see is the disproportionality of how Muslims are mentioned when there's a crime or when something has happened involving Muslims and other communities and other societies. So again, according to analysis, if a Muslim's involved in a crime, it's likely to get 4 times as much media coverage. And we have now in the lexicon of the political talk within the UK certain phrases and terms in relation to incidents that have happened, like 7/7, Lee Rigby, all of these, Woolwich, Westminster. You just need to say one word and you know exactly what's being spoken about. But yet when the right wing do similar sorts of things, when our uncle was murdered in Birmingham, coming home from
Muhammad Salim, you're talking about.
Muhammad Salim,
yeah.
Coming home from the masjid, there's no, it doesn't become part of the lexicon of communication. It doesn't become the normalized manner in which we can just say one word and know exactly. No one can say Birmingham and know what you're talking about. Do you know what I mean? In the way that you would say the Westminster attack or London Bridge.
So are you saying that, the way the media portrays the perpetrators when they're Muslims is negative, but when they portray, say, perpetrators that are not Muslim, it's not necessarily negative? Is that I'm not...
No, not really, because they portray both sides negatively when there's crimes. The two things is, one is the pure amount of coverage, the blasting on all channels 24/7. This is the only news topic for a week, yeah. Compared to if it happens on the other side, it's covered far less. The second thing is, it's the primacy which they place Muslim, the identifiers of Muslim, the Muslim identity as the primary cause of the issue, which they don't do with other groups in society. Yeah.
Okay. So I understand that, but what is Islamophobic about it? I understand there's more coverage, there's more focus and everything else, but how is that impacting negatively?
Well,
what's the connection?
This is the thing. As soon as you put Muslim as the identifier, which is the primary cause and the primary reason behind it, not just the person who committed that crime becomes the enemy, everybody linked to that identifier becomes the enemy. So therefore, suddenly now every single Muslim needs to prove their humanity, needs to prove their innocence, needs to prove that they're not part of this crime that's happened. And you see that even when Muslims that have got nothing to do with anything that's happened go on news and are in the media, one of the first things they're asked to do is, "Oh, do you condemn this?" But you don't see that with other types of people, and we've seen that even when we've had.
What is, I mean, what's the issue if someone condemns it? Like it was a crime, it's natural to condemn, isn't it?
But the difference is here that when Muslims are asked to condemn, we're asking all Muslims to prove our humanity. The reason they're not asking Joe Bloggs, the political commentator from the Labour Party, to condemn is because they assume that he's a human being who cares and has feelings and would be appalled by a criminal act. Whereas with Muslims, they are taking the active step to make sure that you pronounce your humanity rather than assuming it for you, rather than giving you the same benefit of the doubt that they would give to any other person who was on their show.
Okay, we mentioned media. I mean, what form of media do you think has the more disproportionate negative impact on Muslims?
I think because of the media laws in the UK, the newspapers are much more free to be opinionated and therefore tend to be a more outwardly and clearly racist source of it. So, for example, you've seen columnists for certain newspapers which have called Muslims barbaric, that have called for, in some instances, a final.
But if it's an opinion piece, it's freedom of speech, isn't it? It's like, I mean, you have people will say something opposite, or
Well, let's think about this. Would it be acceptable for somebody to call for a final solution for the Jewish problem in the UK? No, we would never accept that.
Of course not, yeah.
It would be completely. It would be completely outside of the bounds of. And for example, if somebody decided to call black people in the UK barbaric, that would be completely beyond the realms of acceptability. But all of these things are fair game when you're dealing with Muslims. Yeah, okay. There are no bounds of respectability, and there are no lines that you can't cross when you're insulting Muslims. And in other countries in Europe, even there are no lines that you can cross when insulting the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Okay, I mean, you brought that in. Charlie Hebdo, the magazine, printed it and everything else, and we saw what was happening in France and everything. But do you not feel like that you're as Muslims, that there's, you just want people to give you a special pass or something? If Muslims are involved in these things, then they should be mentioned. That's one angle. The other angle is if we live in a society where everyone has the right to have an opinion and free to say whatever, as long as you're not breaking the law and calling for violence and things like that, what's wrong with that?
Well, the fact is that especially in France, you don't have the freedom to say anything you want as long as it's not calling for violence. They have red lines, and we have red lines in this country as well, okay, of what is acceptable in polite society. So, for example, in France, it's a criminal offence to be a Holocaust denier. Right. That's seen as a red line that if you cross this, and even if you just talk about that, you're now crossing into the realms of beyond what is acceptable for society to have as a discussion. So we offer those protections and we say, accept that there are limits to free speech, but there are none of these protections for Muslims.
So there are limits, but those limits don't really protect Muslims or Muslim sensitivities. That's what you're saying.
Of course.
Okay, so I mean, just focusing here in the UK, I mean, you mentioned newspapers mainly having more freedom to do these things. In terms of newspapers themselves, there are lots of Muslims that also work there. I mean, isn't that helping to counterbalance the kind of narrative that you're saying is problematic?
Unfortunately, if you speak to many Muslim journalists who have worked in the major newsrooms, at major papers in the UK, they'll tell you the same sort of story. That once you get in there, there's a massive push to be conformist, to be accepting, to follow the narrative that's already being pushed. So it takes an exceptionally brave person to basically on their own, as such a tiny proportion of the newsroom, to buck that trend and swim upstream and say, no, I don't accept this. And at most institutions, that's not really something that can be done easily without crippling your own career. What we do see is there have been some exceptional journalists who, largely once they've got out of the mainstream system, have really held power to account. I don't know if I could, Sister Yvonne Ridley, mashallah, is always speaking truth to power. And she's done that from largely outside of the realms of the mainstream sources.
Okay, Kaleem, I mean, we focused on the mainstream media, if you like. I just want to talk about social media. And you know, what do you see? Is that problematic as well, or is it a little bit better there?
Social media is the Wild West right now.
Right.
There's very, very little that anybody can do to police or manage social media. And I suppose when we're talking about social media, we're actually closer to talking about sort of like EDL and street level thugs rather than sort of like big conglomerates. And the problem is there with anonymity and with all of these sorts of things, you just end up in breeding pits of hate, which are not just spreading hate towards Muslims, but generally also spreading hate to people and organisations like that support Black people and their fight against racism, and now especially with the rise of or the return in a big way of conspiracy theories, a lot of anti-Semitism as well, and so. Especially in the online space, it really, really is the Wild West.
One word answer. Does it need better regulation?
I fear regulation because the regulators will then begin to choose who can and can't have a voice.
Okay.
That was one word.
That was a one word. You heard that. Okay. Jazakallah khair, Kaleem, for that. I mean, we've been highlighting the kind of difficulties and issues with mainstream media, a little bit about social media. I want to move on the conversation and bring in Sister Sahar Al-Faifi and talk about really what a lot of people understand and see as Islamophobia, which is the impact on the person themselves, and in particular our sisters. Assalamu alaikum, Sahar. Can you hear me?
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yes, I can hear you. Thank you so much for having me today.
Jazakallah khair for joining us. And just, I mean, start off, I mean, from your point of view, how is Islamophobia impacting yourself and people around you?
Thank you so much for your question. I think the sisters wearing the hijab are visibly Muslim, and therefore they have been the primary target for so many overt Islamophobic abuse that can be variable from being verbal to even being physical to even murder. We have spoken about Muhammad Salim, who was stabbed to death in Birmingham. But we recently, a couple of years ago, Nadia Hussein was run over in Leicester. And no, we didn't hear that in the news as much. We have seen sisters who were stabbed in Paris recently with the recent attacks and Islamophobic sentiments expressed by high-profile politicians. And that is the issue here. You know, over the years, we thought Islamophobia is restricted, is limited to the far right. But over the recent years, we've seen people and politicians across the political spectrum making Islamophobic and racist statements and sentences. That has an impact on sisters. Recently, we know what Boris Johnson said about sisters who wear the niqab, describes them as robbers.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, you have obviously these attacks, but I mean, for sisters who are, you know, visibly, like yourself, wearing a niqab or even the hijab and everything else, I mean, just give our viewers a personal experience that, you know, what is it actually like to be in society and maintain your values?
Yeah, definitely. I can share my personal story, but also other stories. And I remember that after Boris Johnson made his statement, I was abused a week after that by white men in suits in Birmingham train station, and that was the difference. Like these words are not just words; has a ripple effect on the victim and their families. Sisters who even don't wear the hijab. Or not identified as Muslims are also have been a target. And what you see is that sisters thinking twice about where to go, or they have to be in constant communication with their family who are worried about their safety. You've got, I come across two sisters, one was the niqab and one wear a hijab or niqab, but the sister who doesn't wear the hijab are actually frightened and has anxiety issues for his sister who wears the niqab. And these are the intricates and the details of Islam you see on women. And interestingly, most of the perpetrators are actually white men. And therefore, a lot of academics and researchers describe this type of Islamophobia as gendered Islamophobia. It's a
Right.
type of violence against women.
Right. I mean, you mentioned some of really traumatic things. I just want to unpick one or two of those. So first thing, I think you mentioned about the anxiety sisters feel leaving the house, participating in everyday activities like whether it's work or going to college or university or just actually going out and enjoying the sun or whatever it is. How does someone overcome, like yourself? How does someone overcome this anxiety?
Mm. I think it's tricky and it's different from one person to other because what you notice that these abuse, if it happens once, it really does affect the psyche of the victim. And what I mean by that, I could be walking in the street and looking left and right, just expecting something bad to happen. It's this anxiety that you constantly have at the back of your mind. And
Right.
for me, the way to overcome it, I found that number one, I actually respond to these perpetrators. I don't let it go. I tend to embarrass them in public, and it shocks them most of the time. It's like, oh, she speaks English. Yes,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
embarrass you in
yeah.
public.
I can imagine. Yeah, I
A
mean,
lot.
yeah. The other, I mean, flip side of it is, there'll be people who say, well, this isn't British attire. This is you're not integrating. You're isolating yourself. You're being different. How do you respond to these things?
These questions have become so ironic now during COVID, to be honest, because everyone now are wearing an
Face
niqab,
mask.
really,
Yeah.
including Boris Johnson himself. And there's a lot of irony in there because now no one is talking about the masks being communication barrier or the people are not being able to be identified and so on. But in the past, this is what we used to hear in the media about sisters. Like they are failing to integrate, there are barriers to communications. But COVID actually has taught us all a lesson that is not only not a barrier to communication, but it's the ability to connect with people, without the need to see them. So it's quite ironic what we see.
And I mean, we talk about the irony. You're absolutely right because a lot of people they have to wear the mask doing their work and everything else, and it all seems to be okay. But the other issue is that people would say Muslim women, they don't tend to like mix with the way society is. Is that something that that you've come across where you're expected to behave in a certain way, where maybe it's against the grain of your value and everything else? I mean, how do you negotiate these things?
I mean, yeah, there is this expectations on women to do more, but there are different elements to this conversation. Number one, the sisters who decided to wear the niqab are actually a minority within a minority, so you don't see them as much as the other sisters. But also the argument that Muslim sisters are not actually integrating is a false argument. We have seen sisters who are scientists, who are scholars, who are doctors, who are not nurses, and so on. They've been not only participating in the job, but also taking a public role. But it's actually one of the main narratives of the Islamophobes that Islam oppresses women and they need someone to speak on their behalf. And you have this kind of white savior complex where we need white feminists or white men to save Muslim women from their own faith and culture. So it's a colonialist narrative, it's an Islamophobic narrative, and it's far from the truth.
Okay, I mean, putting narratives aside and everything else, in terms of the hate, I mean, you kind of mentioned, how certain words from politicians and everything else can have an impact, you mentioned, like a ripple effect. What about how the behavior of Muslims themselves? Do you think, I mean, a lot of people say, look, there's no smoke without any fire. The way Muslims behave and everything else, that's problematic as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. There are attempts to dilute the problem of Islamophobia and reduce it to only the verbal or hate crimes in the street. And the truth is that Islamophobia is far more sophisticated than that and is being normalized, as Brother Kerry said, by the media, but also by politicians, but also by laws that have been introduced and have been targeting the Muslim community institutionally speaking, from the Stop and Search to Schedule 7 to the difficulties in finding jobs. Muslim women specifically, they face triple discrimination against their faith, against their gender, and against their color, and they pay the highest ethnic penalty when it comes to applying for jobs. And then we blame them for not being integrating enough in the society.
So, I mean, how do you, you just mentioned all of that stuff, and I'm just thinking, you're right, you're getting a penalty because you're a woman, you're getting a penalty because you're ethnic, you're getting a penalty because you're Muslim, you're getting a penalty because you're wearing a hijab or a niqab, and then you're expected, and it's said you're not integrating enough. Like, how do you overcome this mountain?
I think it's a huge mountain to climb, to be honest. But I feel that as Muslim community, we really need to organize ourselves and lead this fight. And this is what has been happening in the last few years. We've been relying on the left to fight our own fight. And we need to change this mindset and this mentality. We need to empower sisters actually to lead this fight, being the primary victims of Islamophobia. Muslim organizations must not be apologetic about it. They must not dilute the issue and have to speak about the different manifestation of Islamophobia, not just put your head down most of the time, because Islamophobia is affecting the Muslims today. And it can actually get worse in the future. Our children might not be able to pray at schools in the future. Our sisters might not be able to express their identity and their faith wearing their hijab if we don't take an action now.
Okay. Well, Jazakallah khair, Sister Sahar, for that. Stay there. I'm going to bring in Muazzam to talk about the institutional form of Islamophobia, and actually maybe start off with asking the first question: what is institutional Islamophobia? I mean, how do you understand it? How do you explain it to our viewers?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and jazakallah khair for having me on. Institutional Islamophobia, first, most really important to understand that the concept of Islamophobia didn't exist up until, I think, the mid to late 90s. But Islamophobia was worse in a sense in Europe than it is now, and it doesn't get worse than genocide. So I was in Bosnia during the war there at that time, and I remember, of course, when the Srebrenica massacre happened, 8,000 Muslim men and young boys were killed. But before that had happened, 50,000 Muslim women were placed in rape camps. Men were placed into concentration camps. Entire cities were ethnically cleansed. And it's really important that we get this point. These were white, Slavic, in many cases, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims who were being killed by other white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Slavic people who are not Muslims. So this wasn't racism. You couldn't marry the issue of racism here together. It's not about race. This is about Islam. They were being wiped out because they were Muslims. And so this happened, as I said, more than a decade before the term Islamophobia was coined. And when it came eventually, it started to talk about the attitudes towards Muslims and Islam in general. And it was heightened at the beginning of the war on terrorism. The first most Islamophobic law that was passed was after the 9/11 attacks in Britain. A bill was forced through Parliament within a few weeks, which under anti-terror legislation, emergency legislation, allowed for the detention of 13 North African and Middle Eastern men in Britain without charge or trial. So they took away the very basic concepts of Magna Carta, habeas corpus, and all these great so-called British institutions, and they removed it and put it on these men. And by doing so, they said that we can detain people without charge or trial, not in Guatemala or Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib, in Britain, Belmarsh, London, Woolwich. That's where they were doing this. And it could be done because they were Muslims. They tried to do this with the Irish before, of course. We've got to understand that when they interned people without charge or trial in Northern Ireland in the 1970s, people rose up. And the Bloody Sunday March happened and people were killed, and the rest, as it were, was history. But when they did it to Muslims over here, nobody really cared, including Muslims. In fact, the people who were least likely to respond to this gross violation of Muslim rights were Muslims. This was the first stepping stone. After that, there was a series of laws which allowed.
Sorry, Muazzam, to interrupt you. Even on this, I mean, what would you say? I mean, I hear you're saying it's a draconian law to detain someone without any charge or trial, but there was a security issue. 9/11 had happened. There was a threat. The government surely needed to act on that threat to keep the nation secure.
I agree, but it's acting in the right way, not the wrong way. So what happened in the case of these particular men? The House of Lords ruled, which was the highest court of appeal at that time, the highest court in the country at that time, that the detention of these men had been unconstitutional, hence illegal. Now, if you or I were to detain somebody in our house for 3 hours, let alone 3 years, without charge or trial, it would be called false imprisonment and kidnap. The government did it and it got away with it. And then it instituted more laws and a whole series of laws. So almost every year, there's been a new law since the beginning of the war on terror until now. They had the introduction of control orders, well, essentially were the details or the application of house arrest in Britain, not Burma. And
can you
these ideas that you'd associate with other countries that are third world despotic nations now are synonymous with Britain and the British experience, but the British experience with Muslims. And this isn't happening at as Sahar explained, only at a level where somebody's getting their niqab or hijab pulled off or getting chased down the road by the EDL. This is happening at state level. And I want to give you just one example that proves this beyond any doubt at all. Cambridge University did a study in 2016 and found that 88% of people stopped at airports under Schedule 7 were Muslims. Now, Muslims constitute 5% of the entire population. And Schedule 7, for those who don't know, so you understand this, is akin to the sus laws that took place in the 70s and the 80s against the black community, where you could stop and search people on no suspicion at all. And here, under Schedule 7, there is no suspicion. The police officer doesn't require suspicion to stop you, to search you, to take your DNA, take your fingerprints, your photograph, to strip search you, to take your electronic devices, to force you to hand over passwords, to keep you in detention for up to 6 hours without the presence of a lawyer. Now, this is something out of South Africa, apartheid South Africa. These type of laws existed there, or Israel or elsewhere. You wouldn't associate this with Britain. But because the majority of the population, i.e. the white non-Muslim population, never gets Schedule 7, they don't even know that this law exists. But there's an entire population of Muslims who, for them, this is a daily occurrence. And that's just one of the multitude of laws. If I was to give you another one,
well, before you do, let me just ask the question, just so that we get some clarity. If, I mean, like we were talking about with the media and everything else, if there are criminal acts that are taking place or crime being committed by certain population, members of the population, surely it makes sense to use whatever legislation you have to focus on that community.
Well,
Isn't
that would
this
make
what's
sense,
happening
right?
here?
That would make sense, but you see, when you're talking about that legislation, every year I've said to you, there's a new law being passed every single year, to the point at which you've got 3-year-olds being interrogated by police and prevent officers because they mispronounced a word. Now, 3,000 people died, not 30 or 300 or 100 or less, which is what's happened within 20 years. Less than 100 people have died. 3,000 people died during the Irish conflict with Britain. 3,000. They hit 10 Downing Street. They hit the MI5 building. They bombed Harrods. They bombed Enniskillen. They killed 28 people in 1998 with an IRA bombing. They hit the BBC building, and they killed the Lord Mountbatten, the Queen's cousin. You never had the types of laws then that you have now. So clearly, you have an Islamophobic agenda.
So what makes it possible then? I mean, what it seems you're pointing to is that laws that are focused on a Muslim community in particular, but are so draconian that it wouldn't actually be allowed for any other member of or citizens of this country. So what makes it possible for these laws to be passed? I mean, how do they get passed in Parliament?
It's the demonization. It's the multitude of things that Sahar related to and so forth. I mean, one of the things my lawyer Clive Stafford Smith said to me in Guantanamo was this. He said, you know what, the Americans, they used to be afraid of Russia, but they never hated them because they were, essentially were white. And he said that with black people, they've never been afraid of black people, but they hated them. And with Muslims, they both fear you and they hate you at the same time. And it's this lethal combination that's based on ignorance. Because if they were to look at the contribution Islam has given throughout history and in modern times to the very civilization, to the numbers, to the language we speak, you'd end up hating yourself because of that contribution. But that's a different subject. The point is that this is coming from state level. The Islamophobia isn't just from the language of the Boris Johnson or David Cameron or Theresa May from before, or Tony Blair even. It's from the mixture of all these things, that you're invading countries, you're creating laws as a result of those invasions that are being applied almost exclusively to your Muslim population, and then you're telling them, as Sahar said earlier on, that you're not integrating enough, that you're fifth columnists, and that you don't belong, and that we need to govern, and this is what's happening in France. We need to govern the type of Islam that you follow, not you. You are not responsible for your own religion. And that's ridiculous. How can somebody who doesn't even believe in Islam dictate what its laws and
No, I mean, that I totally understand. But how would you then, answer that, there has been violence that's been, meted out in the UK. The perpetrators that were involved were Muslim. So how do you deal with this violence if you don't have laws? If you didn't have these laws, you would need some laws. You'd need something to deal with it.
They have terrorism laws from the time of the IRA, and they were enough to, in many cases, in some cases actually, they locked up people without as miscarriages of justice. But the point of it is they did have tools and mechanisms. They always have had tools and mechanisms to lock people away. Britain has some of the most anti-terror laws in the world. And to create more laws that essentially say, I mean, for example, you take the 2015 Counterterrorism and Security Act, which makes it a legal binding duty upon somebody to report a child or a student or a patient for what could be signs of radicalization, which you were not trained to identify. But look at this. You say it's all about violence, right? Under the Schedule 7 of Terrorism Act, 500,000 people have been stopped, but not a single one of those stops have actually been shown that we are aware of ever stopped an act of terrorism. Not a single one. But what you did is traumatize 500,000 Muslims and those people connected to them. So as a result of that, this isn't. If you take the Prevent, for example, the United Nations said, and I quote in its report 2016-17, that Prevent isn't stopping extremism; it could be causing it. So these laws and wars on terrorism haven't made us any safer. What they've done is you've alienated an entire population and now accepted the language of the far right, which says not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims, which is completely untrue, because you've seen now, as a result of that Islamophobia, the far right is more emboldened now than it's ever been in my living history, in my living memory.
Yeah, no, Jazakallah khair. I think we get the point that you're trying to make, that it is counterproductive and it's not actually producing the desired outcome that's needed. And I just want to thank you, Muazzam and Sahar and Kaleem, and bring you all three into the next part of the conversation. And just, okay, look, we've highlighted issues with the media. We've highlighted attacks that are happening with sisters. They're not integrating enough. We've highlighted state policies, institutionalized form of Islamophobia. And we've understood the problem. How do you, and feel free, whoever wants to jump in, maybe I'll start off with Sahar. How do you feel that, we should respond to this phenomena that we're facing as a Muslim community here in the UK? How do we respond to that? What would your advice be, Sahar?
I think my advice is that إن الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. That Allah will never change the conditions of people until they change within themselves. And that we, as individuals, as activists, as organizations, we have to organize ourselves, but also build broad-based alliances with other organizations of faith and non-faith. Islamophobia is not a Muslim issue. Muslims can be the victim today, but God knows who will be the victim tomorrow. The other thing that is, it's enough and we don't need to apologize anymore. We don't need to condemn any of these terrorist attacks that has nothing to do with the Muslim community or the Muslim faith. We really must be, we should take an unapologetic view where we are proud of who we are, proud of our identity, proud of our faith, and speak truth to power. When the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was asked about what would be the best jihad in your view, he said, كلمة حق عند سلطان جائر, the word of truth in a tyrant. And now we see tyranny. We see tyranny. Islamophobia is a form of tyranny across Europe. And the only way forward is actually for us to equip ourselves with the tools and fight our own fight.
Okay. Kaleem, how would you deal with it? I mean, what would you say to our viewers, yourself? What should we do about this?
I think the sister made an excellent point that Islamophobia is tyranny. And one of the things that really brings that home to me is we're told about British values all the time, that Muslims need to accept British values, that we need to be, and even there's legislation, laws like Prevent, which judge us on our thoughts and question us on our beliefs to see if we match up to this fabled standard of British values. But the truth of the matter is, Islamophobia is eroding British values, not through the Muslims, but through their own laws that they're bringing in. Their own laws that allow them to stop people and hold them without suspicion. Their own laws that allow for secret courts and secret evidence, even criminal trials being held in secret. That's eroding what they claim to hold most sacred of all, their British values. And so this is why their own hatred is a tyranny upon themselves as well. And it was Martin Luther King who said that I don't just go to the South to rid people of racism, so for my good, but I do it for their good because they need to be cured of the hatred in their heart so that they can live happy as well.
Coming to you, Muazzam, you mentioned, and Sahar and Kaleem has mentioned some stuff, and how does, because this is like you mentioned, from Bosnia time, even before that, this is an issue that's been going. But in our context here in the UK, what can we as Muslims do? What are the right steps, to deal with this?
Stuff that we've been trying to do is to hold the government to account. We've given evidence to the International Criminal Court. We've given evidence to the police, to independent judge-led inquiries, and even to war crimes tribal commissions for the role of the British government in the complicity in torture and so forth. But something that I understand, famously Umar al-Khattab said, "Hasibu anfusakum qabla an tuhasibu," that hold yourself to account before you are held to account. We should be holding the government to account. That should be our role, or at least some of us should be holding the government to account. And those who are not able to do that should assist those who are. The other thing I would say is that Sahar mentioned that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not change the the state of the people until they change what is within themselves. And one of the mistakes I think that we have is that because of the war on terrorism and so forth, we're becoming more introverted. And as a result of that, we become more cloistered and we retreat to our own communities. We need to, there's an education that we need to carry out. And one of the things I alluded to earlier on, just take the word alcohol. Most people think that the word alcohol is to do with kuhul, right? It's a word that's very much part of the English lifestyle, alcohol, pubs, and so forth, and drinking. But the word is Arabic, and it comes from al-ghul in Arabic, which is from the Quranic verse. It's from the Quran. Can you imagine selling the EDL on a Friday night? That you may drink this stuff, but the word is ours, and it was from our Quran. The Quran from Surah As-Safat, La fiha ghulun wa lahum anha yunzafun. On that day in paradise, where Muslims are allowed to drink alcohol, there will be no heavy-headedness, and there will be no ghul. There'll be no heavy-headedness. And so it's this contribution that Islam has given, this rich contribution. Arsenal, this famous football team, the word, the place of storage of weapons comes from the Arabic Dar as-Sina al-Asliha, place of manufacture of weapons. The store magazine or a magazine comes from the Arabic Makhazin, which means a place of storage. Sufa is the original word for sofa. Jubba is the word for jumper. There's so many words. In fact, if you ask anybody who's doing their accounts at the end of this year, at the beginning of next, imagine doing your accounts in Roman numerals, because you're using Arabic numerals at the moment. The list is so, without algorithms from Abu Musa al-Khwarizmi's work and al-Jabara, we wouldn't be able to have these computers that we've got today. So we've got such a rich contribution. If there's anything else I want to add to that, COVID-19, who's brought about the vaccine to that? 2 Muslims from Germany of Turkish origin. Stop seeing Islam as the enemy and start recognizing Islam and how much it has contributed to yourself. If you go to the capital,
Jazakallah khair, Muazzam, for that. And I think, you're right. We've got to show the positivity of Islam and challenge it, hold people to account, and do our bit. We need to do our bit. And I think this is really important. Kaleem, Jazakumullah khair for joining us. Sister Sahar and Brother Muazzam, thank you for joining us this evening. Viewers, hopefully you will take solace from the show that, there is a lot that we can do. And that's where we actually need to step in. And first part of doing something is understanding the problem. Hopefully you've understood some of it today. And the next is actually doing some work. Hope you enjoyed the show. See you soon. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.